Bom dia, dignitarios, convidados, delegados, psicólogos e estudantes. And that's the extent of my very bad Portuguese. It is indeed an honor to be here, to be invited to deliver a keynote address at the 12th CONGRESSO NACIONAL de Psicologia Escolar e Educacional and the 37th Conference of the International School Psychology Association. Let me begin by apologizing to my Brazilian host and colleagues for not being able to speak your language, Portuguese. I'm sorry. I'm hopelessly monolingual. I only speak English. At the direction of the scientific committee of ABRAPEE, the slides that will be shown are in Portuguese. And to my English-speaking colleagues, who like me may not be able to read or speak Portuguese, I will try to be as clear as I can in my English presentation. And I'm happy to send you the English slides if you would like to receive them after this talk. And again, forgive me because I'll be juggling two laptops, English on the one in front of me and Portuguese, the one to my right. And hopefully I'll be able to multitask. Okay. So, to begin, I hope to, I'll be talking about several things. Why should we pay attention to social identities? I'll talk about culture, ethnicity, race, and identity and how those have an intersection with academic functioning. I'll talk about theories that are explaining the achievement gap, and I'll talk about interventions based on those theories. And lastly, I'll issue what I call a challenge to the field. So, in the next few minutes, I'll be using theories and data primarily from the United States to make my points. My intention is not to say that the United States has better research or data, or the correct research or data, but rather to highlight the lack of attention to some of our most vulnerable populations in school psychology research and practice. We often do not study in as great detail the groups that are marginalized, whether we are talking about North America, South America, Europe, or around the world. So here are data from the United States, enrollment data from 2002 and 2012. As can be seen, the white population in the United States is getting smaller, and the minority populations are getting larger. And this is, in fact, something that's happening in many countries. While the white populations in many countries are still very large, there are increasingly large groups of minority populations, even in countries, sometimes in Scandinavia and other countries that historically had one dominant ethnic group. They're getting large immigrant populations. At the same time that this is happening, we have going on a performance gap, what we call in the United States an achievement gap. And so these are scores for students in grade 4 on reading, and as you can see that African Americans, American Indians, Latinos are actually doing less well than European Americans and Asian Americans. And these data apply to grade 8 and to grade 12. So the pattern is the same throughout the school, the K-12 schooling career, and it is also the same in mathematics. We have the same pattern in mathematics. Now, apart from the fact that there's this gap, there's another reason why the gap is a problem. These scores actually reflect proficiency levels. And so in the US, we often talk about 5 proficiency levels with students from far below basic to advanced. And what we see is that students from the minority groups are actually scoring in the far below basic and the below basic levels. So if we look at this slide, these are for students who are scoring advanced. We can see only 16% of African Americans are scoring at the advanced as opposed to 47% for Asian and European Americans. And these data also apply to socioeconomic status, to poverty. Children in poverty are doing less well than children from families with incomes. So if your parents are college graduates, 49% of the children of college graduates are scoring at the advanced level, whereas only 24% of the children of people who are not, just have a high school diploma or less. And so this achievement gap affects kids of poverty, kids of color. Again, same pattern in mathematics. And what does this result in? So, at least in the US, and I suspect in many other parts of the world, and including here in Brazil, that graduating from high school, going on to college is becoming increasingly important for people to make a decent living, for people to contribute to society. And these are the graduation rates for some of the top cities in the US, large city districts in the United States. What all of these districts have in common is they have large populations of African Americans, Latinos, large populations of low-income students. And so we see, again, less than 50% of students are completing high school. New York, Minneapolis, Baltimore, Detroit. So why is that important to us as school psychologists? School psychologists are, in point of fact, the general practitioners of psychology in the school system. We are not there simply to help teachers teach better and students who are advanced do better. We are there, in fact, to help the students who are the most vulnerable, the ones who are not doing well. We are there to help the teachers work with the students who need teaching the most. And what are we doing as a group? We are studying a lot of things. We are studying consultation, behavior modification, motivation, school climate, in the thousands. But when we look at how are we studying the cultural groups that are not doing well, the low-income and minority groups that are not doing well, as you can see, our research is lagging. So even though we are spending a lot of time studying important things, we are not studying those topics in the groups where they may be most important. So, to shift a bit. Now, so that this is to set the stage, I'm going to turn to the idea of identity and why identity matters. There are, coordination here. There are sort of two types of identity, and identity theories talk about two types of identity. Personal identity or individuality, your personality, who am I? You know, am I extroverted, intelligent, motivated, etc.? And as well, we talk about social identity, or the reference groups that I belong to. To what group or groups do I belong to? And does my group membership affect my interactions with society? And in these terms, that culture, ethnicity, race become important variables. Culture, the characteristic attitudes and behaviors of a particular group within society. Our ethnic identity, our feeling of belonging to our group. You know, a clear understanding of what it means to be a member of our group. And racial identity is a similar construct, but typically applied to groups of whites and blacks. There are a fair amount of commonalities among these constructs. First, it's membership in a particular group. So do I see myself as male, female? Do I see myself as African American? Do I see myself as black, white, Latino? And also, what does my sense of group belonging say about my psychological identity, the values, the beliefs, the statuses that I hold in society? So we can look at several different types of personal and social identities. Intelligence, personality, motivation, self-esteem, self-efficacy, and sort of my ethnic racial group, the first language that I belong to, my gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. These are important because personal identity and social identity are connected. So both personal and social identity are shaped by our environment, and the links between personal and social identity are determined in part by what society communicates to us. What does society tell us that we are? And personal and social identity then interact to affect our motivation and performance. And the major theoretical frameworks in the US, at least, that explain the achievement gap are all theories of identity. And what this means then is that for us as students, as school psychologists, as educational psychologists, that the academic identities that we are trying to develop in our students need to come out of their personal and social identities, and we therefore need to pay attention to these. And in our training programs for psychologists, but in our training programs for teachers, in our consultation with teachers, these become important. So, academic identity. So, I can ask a question. How would you describe yourself as a student? Poor, fair, good, or excellent? So how many people here saw themselves were good or excellent students? Yeah, put the hands up higher. Yeah, great. So I would suspect a fair number of you here. You are psychologists, you are professionals, you are in graduate school. I actually grew up in Trinidad and Tobago, and we have to do an exam at the end of elementary school to go on to secondary school. And at age 11, I took that exam. I actually was put into the top school for boys, and within 6 weeks, we had a common exam, and I was put in the top class of the top school for boys. And so what that did, before I turned 12 years old, the society had told me that I was a good student. But for many of the kids that we are concerned about, they get the opposite message. They get told that they're not good students. And I would say that even at the high school that I went to, the secondary school I went to, I was told I was a good student. I was moved to the top class. There were students who had got into that school, but who were moved down to the bottom class, and who were told even at that top school that they were not good students. And that those beliefs, those attitudes followed them to the rest of their schooling career, and so I did well and many of them did not. So, the two major theoretical frameworks for explaining the achievement gap in the United States are cultural ecological theory by John Ogbu and stereotype threat by Claude Steele. What is, I think, particularly, I'm glad these frameworks exist, but I'm troubled because John Ogbu was an educational anthropologist. Claude Steele is a social psychologist. These are the people who are telling us about schooling, and we as school and educational psychologists are not in this game. I will share a fair amount of research with you showing work in these areas, and it's being done by people who are not school and educational psychologists. And one of the big calls today is for us who are in the schools to do the kind of research, because we don't know if the claims that are being made will be substantiated in schools. What kinds of changes need to be made to these theoretical frameworks to apply to schools, the schools that we serve in on a regular basis? So that is, in fact, my challenge to school psychology today, right? Can we find empirical evidence in support of these frameworks? Do the interventions that come out of these frameworks replicate in schools that we work in? And what does school psychology have to say about the viability of these frameworks? So, cultural ecological theory. Cultural ecological theory is the study of institutionalized and socially transmitted patterns of behavior, right? So, what are the patterns of behavior that are passed on via families, via culture? Cultural ecological theory postulates that the relationship between the personal attributes and behaviors of a group, what I do, and the group's environment is to be found in the tasks that group members have devised for coping with environmental demands. So in the context of the United States, in the context of Brazil, as I was hearing at the opening ceremony last night, Students who, in point of fact, have been told that they are less than, that they are second-class citizens, that they are not worth as much as others, will be less likely to engage in schooling if schooling is seen as part of the system that is oppressing them. So cultural ecological theory comes out of the experiences then of the disproportionate school failure in the historical and societal relationships with the dominant groups in society. In the United States, that includes American Indians and Alaska Natives, African Americans, and Latinos of all types. And the lower academic performance then of these groups, that achievement gap, those graphs that I showed earlier, are in some sense a result of these discriminatory practices. So in this cartoon, what in fact this young man is saying to his teacher is, of course I didn't spell it correctly. I didn't spell it your way. I spelled it the way that reflects my identity. And so he is getting the wrong answer, but he is actually being defiant. He's saying, I will not spell it your way. I will spell it the way that reflects my culture. And therefore, that will then lead to, in fact, lack of success in school. So the questions that cultural ecological theory asks is, how did the group become a member of the society? But more importantly, how does mainstream society treat the group members? Are they included? Are they valued? Are their traditions recognized and honored? Or are they excluded, devalued, denigrated, and discriminated against? And how do group members then respond to the mainstream society? Do they respond in a positive relationship with society or in opposition to society? So the next two slides are very busy, and I will just highlight a couple things from them. Basically, these slides, this slide and the next one are from Ogbu and Simon's 1998. And they're speaking to several important points. Basically, they're talking about things like the job ceiling here, political and legal barriers, discriminatory policies, policies within school that discriminate. For example, certain groups in the United States are expelled more, they get more harsh discipline, and so forth. And all of those things come together in a societal framework to affect how those students as a group respond to society. So Ogbu argues that for some groups, that as I succeeded in the United States, but I went to the United States from Trinidad and Tobago. And so that in some sense, I am protected. I have what Ogbu calls a dual frame of reference, that I can say I have a home to go back to. So if the United States does not work out for me, I have somewhere else to go. And when they're treating me badly here, that's Americans. I do not have to own that. But if I'm African American or Latino, if this is my home, I have nowhere else to go, and I'm being treated badly, I do not have that protection of the dual frame of reference, right? And that's the important thing to keep in mind. So see, cultural ecological theory talks about several things. Not all members of discriminated groups respond in the same way. The messages matter. Several types of responses are possible, and some responses lead to poor performance. So let's look at two students. So these are two students from Nazir 2012. DJ and Zeus grew up in the same neighborhood. They're both 16 years old, both male, live in impoverished neighborhoods. They've struggled academically in middle school. They are both quick-witted. They both have good senses of humor. But DJ is on two sports teams in school. He took honors courses. He sees himself as becoming a change agent in his community, which has drugs and prostitution. And he has a sense of a historical legacy. He wants to move forward and help his people. Zeus did not participate in any extracurricular activities. He played games in the hallway. He was not sure if he would graduate from high school at all, and he participated in the street economy. He sold drugs. And he defines himself in relationship to the street rather than in relationship to the historical legacy of racism and slavery in America. Which one of these will do better in school? I think it's very clear. Our task as school psychologists is to get all of the students to choose DJ's path rather than to choose the path of Zeus. And even though they've gone to the same schools, they're interpreting that schools in the same way. Part of our job as school psychologists is to help teachers and students reframe their experiences and choose that pathway that will lead to them, in fact, having a positive impact on themselves and ultimately on society. So there are multiple pathways that students can choose. Zeus chose this one, the encapsulated pathway. And what that means, and unfortunately, large percentages of the discriminated groups choose that pathway. The encapsulated pathway speaks to several things, that these are minority students who equate doing well in school with acting white, or and they make no attempt. They don't want to act white because they see whites as oppressors. And it could be whites in America, but it depends on the dominant group. They see the dominant group in society as oppressive. They reject schooling because it's reflective of the dominant group. And so they do not try to learn what school is having to offer. And therefore, they don't do well in school. They do not trust that schools have their best interest at heart, right? They see doing well in school not only as adopting the dominant group, but as betraying, as giving up their sense of who they are, giving up their culture. Now, there's contestation in the literature about, is this the case? In fact, on Friday, on my way to the airport, I heard an interview, a professor of law and philosophy say that this does not exist, that there are not people who believe this. But this is a study by some colleagues of mine who asked students had they heard of acting white and acting black, and if they had heard of those things, what did they mean? The students, 81% reporting having heard those terms, and these were students from grades 4 to 12. Acting white meant being intelligent, doing well in school, speaking standard English, having friends who were white. Acting black meant acting ghetto, being dumb and stupid, speaking non-standard English, dressing with sagging pants. There were two very different framings of what it means. And if I believe that doing well in school is acting white and I am not white, if I believe that doing well in school means I am betraying my heritage for the dominant group, am I going to choose to do well in school? So our task then becomes to have students recognize that effort matters rather than who you know, that in fact effort will pay off even if you are a member of a discriminated group, that your choice of role models is important, that you want to choose DJ and the DJ as the role model, not Zeus, right? That in point of fact, culture can be additive, not subtractive. And so that those of you, I only speak English, but I would be better if I spoke English and Portuguese. That in point of fact, learning another doesn't mean giving up what I have. I can have a dual sense, and that dual sense makes me even better. I don't have to give up who I am, and therefore turn my attention to schooling, my attitude to school to a positive rather than a negative one. So, to the other theoretical framework, Claude Steele's stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is premised on the fact that as human beings, we classify variables, we classify behaviors, we classify each other. We have stereotypes of people who wear glasses. We have stereotypes of athletes. We have stereotypes of people who have blonde hair. We have stereotypes of old people. That's what we do. We classify, we make these things, right? And Steele argues that these stereotypes can have a direct impact on the behavior that we engage in. and on the behavior of the people who are stereotyped. And he has demonstrated stereotype threat in several studies. I will take you through one of these now. So in the classic stereotype threat study, it's an experimental design, random assignment to 3 groups, a diagnostic group, a non-diagnostic group, and a non-diagnostic challenge group. Basically, the diagnostic group is told, this study is about reading and verbal reasoning abilities. It's a genuine test of your verbal abilities, and give your best effort because we want you to analyze your verbal ability. The key point here is they keep mentioning ability. The stereotype of African Americans in the United States is that they have low ability, low intelligence. And so they are priming ability in the study. In the control group, the non-diagnostic control group, they are told it's a study of problems, verbal problem solving, right? And all of the same instructions except they use verbal problem solving, and then the last instruction is, we are not measuring ability. And then in the second control group, they're told the same thing, but they're told it's a specifically difficult test. Again, it's about verbal problems, and please take the challenge seriously, because we want you to, to push it. And this pattern has been found in every study. It's one of the most replicated findings in the social psychology literature, that in the diagnostic group where the African American students are told it's about ability, that their performance relative to their white counterparts goes down. Note that with the African American students in the 2 control groups, their performance doesn't change. But this is, it goes even beyond this, because they've been able to show that it's not just the performance, it's what the people, the attitudes that they bring to this. So that if they ask people after they've done the priming to complete these words, students in the diagnostic group are more likely to see them, more likely to see the first word as race rather than face. They are more likely to see inferior rather than exterior. Whereas in the control group, they will see the non-primed word. Moreover, one of the favorite activities of many African Americans, males particularly in the United States, is basketball. In the prime group, the diagnostic group, they actually, African Americans say they don't like basketball, they don't like rap music, they distance themselves from black society, right? Now, stereotypes can also be helpful, right? There is work showing that just as negative stereotypes harm, positive stereotypes facilitate. So that in XII et al. 1997, the stereotype of Asian Americans in the United States, academic stereotype, is that they are very good in mathematics. A stereotype of females in the United States is that they're not good in mathematics. So XII et al. Did a study where they looked at Asian American females. And in one group, they primed their Asian identity. In another group, they primed no identity at all. There's a control group. And in the third group, they primed female identity. In the United States, where we have these strong Asian and female stereotypes, the Asian American females who were primed with their Asian identity did best. Those who were primed with the female identity did worst, and the control group was in the middle. In Canada, where they don't have the same Asian stereotype, there was not the same effect, but there is the female stereotype, and there it is. It manifested itself. So that these things matter. They matter in multiple contexts. This is the context of sport. These are black and white athletes. Those of you who follow basketball and football know that, in fact, basketball and football have very large numbers of African American players. So they looked and they did two sets of priming here. They primed the natural athlete, so being a natural athlete. They primed being an intelligent athlete. They primed race, and then there was a control group. As you can see, and this is golf, so the lower score is the better score. In the natural athlete stereotype, African Americans did better than whites because they are considered natural athletes. But in the intelligent athlete stereotype, priming, the white athletes did better because intelligence, African Americans are low intelligence. We get the same thing when we prime race, and then the control group, they're much closer together. So, and one last study to show you, it affects also the way we respond here with regard to self-handicapping behaviors, that in fact African Americans who are in the prime group are much less likely to report going to sleeping when, before an exam, studying. In other words, they actually self-handicap because, think about this, if you study and you do not do well, you are considered stupid. If you do not study, and you do not do well, you are lazy. Is it better to be lazy than to be stupid? Many people prefer to be lazy than to be stupid. So if I am not sure that I'm going to succeed, I then choose to disengage. I do not study. And if I do well, I'm brilliant. If I don't do well, I'm lazy. If I don't study, but if I studied and I don't do well, I'm stupid, and that I can't get rid of. So I disengage, and so therefore I do much less well. Self-handicapping. So, now, I've been talking a lot about race, but the idea of these stereotypes affects across the board. There are stereotypes about gender, as I showed gender for the mathematics, but there is also stereotypes. In fact, stereotype threat affects SES as well. Poverty. That students from poverty are also less likely to do well in context where, in fact, stereotype of their group comes up. So that we have here where, in fact, poverty is primed. We see that those who are in the low SES, when poverty is primed, do much less well than their wealthy counterparts. We see this as in mathematics, the same thing. The non-dynastic group, they're doing well. Where poverty is primed, low income does the least well, middle income here, and the highest incomes do the best. And so we have the same pattern in English, and the same pattern. This actually speaks to us as psychologists. This is test anxiety. We see that in the diagnostic group for the low income, that in fact their test anxiety is highest. So I think it's very clear that these are things we need to pay attention to. So let's now move to the school setting. So these are studies of students in K-12. McCone and Weinstein have shown that students in grades 1 to 6 differentiate between teachers' behaviors with high-achieving and low-achieving students. How does the teacher know? How do I know what the teacher's stereotype of me is? The way the teacher interacts with me tells me whether the teacher thinks I am smart or not smart. The child who is smart gets longer time to answer the question, whereas the teacher asks me and moves on right away because they do not expect me to answer the question, right? 64% of 8-year-olds, 83% of 9-year-olds, and 93% of 10-year-olds are unable to infer the stereotype about a child from vignettes. And children from stigmatized groups in the United States, African Americans, Latinos, perform significantly less well, and these are again grade 4 and 5 students, elementary school, under stereotype threat conditions. So much so that some of my colleagues argue that this is stereotype threat, this is performance under stereotype threat, this is performance no threat, that this is stigmatized groups. If they were not, this is average performance, and this would be where stigmatized groups would be. Now, I think they're overly optimistic, but I do think it's an important thing for us as school psychologists to investigate. We are the ones in schools. We should be paying attention to these frameworks. So now to turn my attention to some suggestions for interventions that have come out of these frameworks and for studies that we should be doing that we can try. So first, it's really important, and particularly at the middle and high school levels with adolescents, that we tackle, that teachers, that psychologists tackle issues of mistrust of schools, fear of acting white, not believing that I'm going to succeed, so having a low effort, that we tackle those things directly. We need to actually bring those things to students' consciousness, right? Teachers need to work actively on building trust. It's not enough to go into the classroom and say, I'm the teacher, I tell you what to do. If the student does not believe that that teacher has has his or her best interest at heart, that student will not work for that teacher. If that student thinks the teacher is biased against his or her particular group, is more likely to punish kids like him, that student will act in opposition to that teacher. So there's an intervention that a group of colleagues did called WISE feedback. It's an interesting intervention in that they conducted an experimental study looking at how students, black and white students, responded to criticism. So 3 conditions, again, being done by social psychologists, not by educational and school psychologists. We are out of this picture. Condition 1, unbuffered criticism. So the students were given a writing task. They were given a task, write this thing, and if it's good enough, it's going to be published. We will publish it. So 3 conditions. Condition 1, unbuffered criticism. So there was critical feedback. These are the things that need to be fixed. They are not correct. Condition 2, the same critical feedback. These are the things that are not right. They need to be fixed. But overall, it wasn't a bad paper. It was a decent paper, but there are things that need to be fixed. And condition 3, the WISE criticism condition, same critical feedback. These are the things that need to be fixed. Do that. But an explicit statement about standards. I have high standards, and I know you as a student have high standards well, and I know that you have the capacity as a student to do this. So I'm asking you to fix it because I know you can, right? Now, that may seem, and I went through the next 3 slides, so I'll go straight to the, so these are the conditions that I just did. These are the dependent variables. And you would say that this should really have very, very little impact on performance. There were several dependent variables. The student's perception of bias. Did they think the teacher was biased? Secondly, their belief in their ability to improve. And whether they were motivated to do the revision. And third, their sense of self-efficacy as writers. How did they think of themselves as writers? And what do we find? That in terms of ratings of bias, in the unbuffered criticism condition, they are convinced, the black students are convinced that the teachers are biased. The teachers gave them the same feedback they gave the other students, but in a context where I do not trust schools, I do not trust teachers, my interpretation of that straightforward feedback is that the teacher is biased against my group. Now, that's not the case, but that's the way it is perceived, and therefore it's the way that it will affect action, right? In terms of identification, right, motivation and things. So the students, again, in the unbuffered criticism, are less likely to be motivated to proceed. They are not going to do the revision. I'm not going to try. That low effort syndrome, I am pulling back, I am not trying, this teacher doesn't really like me, is biased against me. Whereas when the teacher has said, I know you can do this, I have high standards, I know you have them too, as you can see, the students are performing fine. And in terms of writing skills, same thing. On buffered criticism, their writing skills are lower, but in the assurance that they have the ability, their writing skills are higher. This is replicated in a second study I think this is the second study. So this was replicated in a second study. So I'm not gonna go into that. Another thing that can be done is to promote dual identities. I talked about the fact that just because one does well in school doesn't mean that one doesn't have to do well. I grew up in a very poor family. The house I was born into had no running water. The shower was outside, and it was an open sort of space when it was raining. I didn't even have to turn on that tap that was outside because I got wet from the rain. But that did not mean that I could not be a good student or that I did not have the capacity to be a good student. And so one of the things that we need to do is what we call promote dual identities. Another social psychologist, Daphne Oyserman, and her colleagues did a study where they categorized students into several groups. Aschematic groups, race, ethnicity doesn't matter to me. Dual identity groups. I am a minority, but I am poor, but I am also a member of the larger society. And minority identity only groups, right? And they looked at student performance. And what they found is that academic achievement at the end of semester was stronger for those with dual identities in terms of their end of semester GPA with medium to large effect sizes. The dual identities seem to matter. This original study was of Latinos and African Americans. It was replicated with American Indians in the United States, and it was replicated with Palestinians living in the state of Israel. So again, all of these minority groups that having a dual identity, I'm a minority, but I'm also a member of this society and deserve to be treated with respect. I belong here as much as anybody else. In my own work, we did some work where we did cluster analysis and we identified students on the basis of two variables, ethnic identity and other group orientation. This group here is an alienated group. They are low on ethnic identity and other group orientation. This is an assimilated group. They are high on on other group orientation, but not ethnic identity. This is what I think a lot of people fear, that if they do well in school, they're going to be assimilated. But there is a group, this is a high dual group. They are high on both ethnic identity and on other group orientation. And the interesting pattern is that, in fact, while the assimilated group does well in schools, I'm trying to work with this here, right. While the assimilated group does well in school, so does the high dual group. So these are attitudes, they're attitudes towards teachers. You can see the high dual group is doing as well as, and these two bars represent African Americans and Latinos, so two different groups. But as you can see, the high dual group is doing as well as the assimilated group. That is, they have the same thing in terms of attitude to teachers. They have school belonging and GPA. The impact is less pronounced on GPA, but it's still there, and the effect size is approaching medium. And moreover, if we think about schooling, remember, schooling replicates over time. So I'm coming to the last intervention, and this is an affirmation intervention that was done. In this study, what Cohen and their colleagues did is they actually worked with 7th graders and they gave them a double-blind experiment where they did written affirmations. The control group was told, write about values that are not important to you, but they may be important to someone else. The experimental group was told, write about values that are important to you and why they're important to you. The idea was to try to get the people in the experimental group to get a strong sense of their core, of who they were. And what they showed was that this is the white group, this the black, this is the control group. This is the control group, and this is the intervention group. This group that in fact wrote about values that were important to them declined much less than the control group. This effect was found, maintained 2 years after. The same effect was maintained 2 years after. So in essence, there is literature suggesting that social psychological interventions are things that we as school psychologists should know about. They are having a profound impact on performance. Much of the work has been done in the laboratory. We need to take it into the school setting. That's our task. We are the psychologists who are there. This is an article which summarizes that literature came out in 2011, and there's a subsequent paper in 2013. And so in closing, I am saying a couple things. First, we need to conduct more research on racial and ethnic groups, on groups of poverty. We need to conduct research, a lot more research on the groups that are doing least well in our school settings. We need to examine the relationship of constructs articulated in cultural ecological theory in relation to students' attitudes towards an achievement in schools. Low effort syndrome, right? What trust, mistrust in schools. We need to examine to what extent stereotype threat is a predictor of performance in school settings, not just in the lab, in the experimental lab. We need to conduct research on cultural identities. How important are dual identities? Can we develop dual identities in students who in fact are feeling marginalized from the mainstream? We need to examine social psychological interventions in school settings. How did I get to this research agenda? Because some of my research falls here. When I was a graduate student in the United States in my first year, I went out to dinner with several other graduate students who were African American. As I said, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. And one of those African American graduate students asked me a question. He asked me, do you consider yourself black first or Trinidadian first? And my response was, well, that's a strange question. I am both black and Trinidadian. One is not in front of the other. I am both. And I responded, do you consider yourself black first or American first? And his response was, I am black first and American second. And I asked all of the other African Americans who were there, and they all said the same thing. In my class last fall, I teach a class on social identities and personal social identities and achievement. And we always do this exercise. And all the minority students every year say the same thing. They see themselves as Latino first and American second, as black first and American second. And it seems to me that even though they do not intend it, they are actually saying that I have adopted the fact that I am a second-class person in this society. And it's a mindset here, right? Because when I am now asked, am I American? I say, yes, I'm not American second. I've been living there for 25 years. My passport is American. I am as much a member of that society as anybody else is, and I have a right to every privilege that that society gives me. And so that is, in fact, what we need to do for all of our students. And I will close with this statement. Oops, if I can get it on the right screen. For many individuals, the development of academic talent seems much a matter of chance. There are fortunate circumstances of birth and fortunate matches between a child and his or her proximal communities. Part of our work as educators, and I would add, part of our work as educational and school psychologists, is to understand how to create conditions that allow ever larger portions of our youth to work towards the development of talent, irrespective of where and to whom they were born. Obrigado pela atenção. Thanks for your attention.